I'm Olivia Carter. I'm 34. And on the day my husband mocked me in divorce court, called me a workhorse, a scarecrow, a joke, I did the one thing no one expected. I stood up and took off my dress. Not to shock them, not to beg, but to show them what they never saw. Who I am. And when I dropped that faded blue dress to the floor, the courtroom didn't laugh. It gasped. Because they finally saw the woman I'd been becoming all along. Before I tell you everything, tell me, where are you listening from right now? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. The wind in Seattle that morning was a raw, relentless thing, whipping fallen leaves into frantic spirals as I stepped off the bus. Each gust felt like a physical reminder of the turmoil churning inside me, a silent, desperate prayer for it all to just end. I pulled my threadbare cardigan tighter, the fabric offering little comfort against the biting chill or the deeper cold settling in my bones. I wore an old blue dress, the same one I'd worn a decade ago when I was scrubbing grease from tables as a dishwasher before my hands found purpose in art. It was faded, shapeless, and blended perfectly with the gray morning, a silent uniform for an invisible woman. Underneath, though, was a secret. A rebellion, small and defiant. A dress I'd bought in secret, with savings meticulously hoarded from portrait commissions, each brushstroke a quiet act of defiance against the life I was supposed to accept. It was a shimmering turquoise, a vibrant splash of defiance against the muted canvas of my existence. But on the surface, I looked exactly how they expected, small, tired, ordinary. A woman easily dismissed. Inside the courthouse lobby, the sterile air felt thick with expectation, with judgment. And then I saw them. William, my soon-to-be ex-husband, stood with his shoulders back, a picture of polished arrogance. His mother, Eleanor, a woman carved from ice, stood beside him, her gaze sharp, precise, missing nothing and forgiving even less. And then there was Isabella, a sleek, predatory presence, her arm linked possessively through William's. Her smirk was a sliver of glass, reflecting back every insecurity I'd ever felt. I heard her whisper something, a venomous hiss about my outfit, barely audible but distinct enough to slice through the hum of the lobby. William, ever the eager accomplice, laughed, a short, sharp bark that echoed in the cavernous space. "You could ride her like a draft horse," he said, his voice carrying just enough to reach me. "She's built for labor, not love." The words struck me, not with the force of a blow, but with the dull ache of a truth I'd known for far too long. A workhorse. That's what I was to him. That's all I'd ever been. The laughter that followed, a tinny duet from William and Isabella, was the final chord in a symphony of dismissal. My reflection in the polished marble floor seemed to shrink, to disappear. Then, the clerk called our case. Campbell versus Carter. My name, once so intertwined with his, now severed by a legal formality. I walked into the courtroom, not to fight, not to plead, but to finish something. To cut the last thread binding me to a narrative that was never truly mine. The air in the room was heavy, expectant, and I felt the weight of every gaze, every unspoken judgment. My heart hammered, a frantic drum against my ribs, but my steps were steady. This wasn't just a divorce hearing. This was a reckoning. They used to call me a dreamer. That was before. Before the world decided dreams were a luxury I couldn't afford. I remember the smell of turpentine and pencil shavings from my childhood bedroom, the way the late afternoon sun would slant across my desk, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, creating a halo around the sketches I poured my soul into. I would draw in the margins of my homework, on napkins, on the back of receipts, anything I could get my hands on. Faces, landscapes, the intricate patterns of leaves. It was an escape, a language, a quiet promise to myself. But then, the quiet shattered. My dad died. Suddenly. Unexpectedly. And with him, the light in our house dimmed. My mom, a vibrant woman who'd always hummed while she cooked, retreated into herself, a shadow swallowed by grief. The humming stopped. The laughter ceased. The dream of art, of creation, became a distant echo, a foolish whisper in the face of stark reality. I was 15, and survival became my only masterpiece. I started by washing dishes, the steam scalding my hands, the clatter of plates a constant, jarring soundtrack to my new life. Then waitressing, balancing trays, forced smiles, and the crushing weight of unspoken expectations. Every dollar earned was a shield against the encroaching darkness, a small victory against a world that seemed determined to break us. It was during those long, exhausting shifts that I met William. He was a regular, always ordering the same thing, always leaving a generous tip. He was charming, attentive, and he saw something in me, or so I thought. He said he liked my simplicity, my quiet nature. He said it grounded him, a steady anchor in his fast-paced world. At first, his words were like balm to a raw wound. He swept me into a world I'd only read about in books, a world of comfortable silence, of shared laughter over expensive dinners, of the promise of a future where I wouldn't have to fight so hard just to breathe. He made me believe that my quiet strength, born of necessity, was a virtue. I was so starved for acceptance, for a safe harbor, that I clung to his words like a lifeline. I gave up the odd portrait commission, the late nights spent sketching. His world became my world, and in doing so, I slowly, imperceptibly, began to disappear. But as years bled into each other, that very simplicity, that quiet nature he'd once praised, became the very thing he resented. "You're so predictable, Olivia," he'd say, his voice laced with a boredom that chilled me. "Don't you want more?" More, to him, meant the glittering, superficial world of his friends, the endless pursuit of status, the shallow conversations. And I, who had once dreamed of more than just surviving, found myself trapped in a gilded cage. There were no children. His decision, not mine. "They'd just slow us down," he'd said. No glow-up, no transformation into the sophisticated woman he increasingly seemed to crave. Just the woman he brought home like a rescue pet, tame and grateful, meant to be seen and not heard. And eventually, he stopped pretending. The subtle flirtations became overt. The late nights became unexplained absences. The easy lies rolled off his tongue, each one a fresh cut. He started leaving his phone face down, conversations ending abruptly when I entered a room. The air between us thickened with unspoken truths, with the acrid scent of deceit. His mother, Eleanor, was always there, a silent observer, a co-conspirator in his disillusionment. She'd offer platitudes disguised as advice, her voice smooth as silk, sharp as a razor. "A good wife keeps her man's eyes at home, Olivia," she'd purr, her gaze sweeping over me, dissecting my every flaw. "Perhaps you're not trying hard enough." And I, lost in a fog of self-doubt and desperate to reclaim the affection I felt slipping away, believed her. For years, I twisted myself into knots, trying to be what they wanted, trying to be enough. I tried to be more engaging, more exciting, more everything I wasn't. I lost myself in the process, piece by agonizing piece. Until I didn't. The moment of clarity wasn't a sudden explosion, but a slow, insidious seep of understanding. It was the way William's hand lingered a moment too long on his secretary's arm at a company party. It was the perfume, not mine, clinging to his shirt. It was the late-night texts, the hushed phone calls, the sudden need for business trips. The cracks in the carefully constructed facade grew wider, revealing the hollow core beneath. The pain wasn't just in his actions, but in the casual cruelty of his deception, the blatant disregard for my feelings, for our shared history. And each time I confronted him, his denials were like a fresh layer of concrete poured over the truth, hardening the wall between us. The final straw wasn't a grand gesture, but a small, unremarkable detail. A receipt, crumpled in his jeans pocket for a weekend getaway for two, somewhere I'd always dreamed of going, but he'd always dismissed as too expensive. The date on the receipt was the same weekend he'd told me he was at a mandatory conference. It wasn't just the lie, it was the casual cruelty of it, the quiet arrogance that I would never find out, or if I did, that I wouldn't care. The realization hit me then, a cold, hard truth. I was not loved. I was tolerated. I was convenient. That night, lying awake beside his oblivious form, the scent of a stranger's perfume still clinging to his pillow, I knew I couldn't live like this anymore. The silence in the house, once a comfort, had become a suffocating shroud. My own reflection in the dark window stared back, a stranger with hollow eyes and a spirit slowly eroding. The quiet woman they had molded me into had been broken down, but in the shattering, something new, something resilient, was beginning to form. A flicker of fire in the ashes. The quiet whisper of a voice, long silenced, began to stir. Enough. And with that whispered word, a new kind of strength began to grow, not loud or defiant, but deep and unyielding. It was the kind of strength that blooms in the dark, forged in the crucible of quiet desperation. The kind that comes when you realize the only person who can save you is you. The courtroom hummed with a low, expectant energy. William, on the stand, didn't hold back. His voice, amplified by the microphone, filled the room, each word a carefully crafted barb designed to diminish me. He painted a picture of me as unmotivated, unambitious, a drain on his vibrant life. She lacked ambition, he declared, his gaze sweeping over the judge, then briefly, contemptuously, over me. She didn't meet my expectations. Our lives diverged. I needed a partner, not a fixture. He spoke of my quiet nature as a flaw, my artistic pursuits as childish whims. His lawyer, a slick, expensive man with a perpetually bored expression, nodded sagely. Eleanor, in the gallery, watched me with a tight, satisfied smile, as if her predictions about my inadequacy were finally being validated. Even Isabella, perched beside her, giggled when William, warming to his performance, leaned into the microphone and, with a dismissive wave of his hand towards me, called me a scarecrow. The word hung in the air, a cruel echo of a childhood taunt. A scarecrow. Lifeless. Useless. Unwanted. A ripple of low laughter, barely suppressed, ran through the back rows, from William's friends, his loyal, unthinking entourage. The humiliation was a hot, bitter taste in my mouth, burning in my cheeks. Every fiber of my being screamed to lash out, to defend myself, to expose the lie of his words, to shatter his carefully constructed facade. But still I stayed silent. Not because I agreed. Oh no. The agreement had long since evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. Not because I was resigned or broken or beaten. No. The silence was a deliberate choice. A calculated delay. Because I was waiting. For this moment. The judge, a formidable woman with a stern but perceptive gaze, finally cut him off, a faint frown creasing her brow. Mr. Campbell, I believe we have heard enough about your personal assessments. Let us move to the financial disclosures. It was my turn to speak, or so everyone thought. But my voice wouldn't be words. Not yet. I rose from my chair, my movements slow, deliberate, each action imbued with a quiet purpose. The courtroom, which had been buzzing with the aftermath of William's performance, fell into a hush. All eyes were on me. I felt the weight of their scrutiny, the judgment, the pity, the expectation of tears, of a breakdown. But I offered none of that. Instead, I reached for the buttons of the old blue dress. My fingers, surprisingly steady, undid each one, slowly, methodically. The fabric, worn soft from countless washes, whispered as it loosened. The room was utterly silent now, every breath held. I felt William's eyes on me, his initial smugness replaced by a flicker of confusion, then alarm. Isabella's smirk faltered. Eleanor's face, usually so impassive, contorted into a mask of disbelief. And then I let it fall. The faded blue dress, a symbol of my past, of their expectations, of the woman I was supposed to be, pulled around my ankles like a discarded skin. And beneath it, revealed to the stunned silence of the courtroom, was the turquoise dress. The color of deep, cool water, of unexpected depths. It clung to my form, accentuating the curves they'd called workhorse, the strength they'd dismissed as labor. It was elegant, understated, and utterly, unequivocally, me. Beneath that faded cloth, a dull, unremarkable cocoon, was the stunning turquoise dress. It wasn't about being flashy or drawing attention, it was about unveiling. A fitted neckline, clean seams that spoke of quiet precision, of a garment chosen and cared for. It was my choice. My color. a vibrant echo of the inner world I had kept hidden meticulously for so long. The fabric, a soft silk, felt cool against my skin, a calming presence amidst the rising chaos in the room. I raised my hands to my hair, which I'd tied back in a severe, no-nonsense bun, the way Eleanor always preferred it. My fingers unclipped the simple, utilitarian claw that held it captive. And as the clip fell, a soft click against the polished floor, my golden waves cascaded over my shoulders, framing my face, softening the harsh lines of exhaustion and hurt. It was a simple act, yet it felt monumental. A release. A reclaiming of something lost. And in that moment, the courtroom shifted. It was palpable, almost audible, like a collective intake of breath. The air crackled with a new kind of energy, no longer heavy with judgment, but thick with surprise. Phones, once discreetly tucked away, came out, cameras flashing, catching the unexpected tableau. A low murmur rippled through the gallery, growing into distinct, astonished gasps. It wasn't because I looked like a model, or because I was suddenly transformed into some impossible ideal. It was because I looked like me finally. The woman they had dismissed, the woman they had called a scarecrow, a workhorse, was standing before them, utterly self-possessed. Not with defiance, not with anger, but with a quiet, undeniable strength. My shoulders, once habitually hunched, straightened. My chin, usually tucked in deference, lifted. I met William's gaze, and for the first time in a decade, I saw genuine shock, then a flicker of fear in his eyes. He froze, his smug mask crumbling. The color drained from his face, leaving him pale and shaken. His mother, Eleanor, who had always projected an aura of impenetrable composure, stared. Her lips, usually a thin, precise line, were slightly parted, her eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and something akin to horror. Her carefully constructed world, where I was merely a backdrop to their superior lives, was cracking. And Isabella wilted. Her polished smirk dissolved into a look of bewildered resentment. She looked away, unable to meet my gaze, unable to reconcile the woman she had mocked with the one standing before her. You see, you can't compete with a woman who has nothing left to lose and nothing to prove. When you are stripped bare, when your greatest fears have materialized, when the people you trusted betray you in the most public way, a strange kind of liberation washes over you. The fear dissipates. The shame lifts. What more could they do? They had already taken everything they could. And in that void, in that quiet space of utter vulnerability, an undeniable power emerges. It's the power of authenticity, of truth, of knowing exactly who you are, unburdened by external expectations. It's the power of having found your own footing, even after the ground beneath you has crumbled. I stood there, not to gloat, not to provoke, but to embody a truth that had been denied. The silence stretched, a living thing, heavy with unspoken realizations. The flash of cameras, the low hum of whispers, the stunned faces, they were all just noise. What mattered was the feeling of the silk against my skin, the gentle sway of my hair, the quiet strength that hummed within me. I was no longer a reflection of their disdain, but a mirror reflecting their own shallow cruelty back at them. And in that reflection, they saw not a victim, but a survivor. Not a scarecrow, but a woman finally blossoming into her own. The air in the courtroom, once oppressive, now felt charged with a different kind of energy, a quiet anticipation. They had seen the dress, yes, but more importantly, they had seen the woman underneath. And she was not, by any definition, a workhorse. She was a force. I wasn't just there to impress, to make a statement with a dress. That was merely the opening act. The true purpose of my presence, the quiet, meticulous work of weeks, months even, was still to come. After the gasps subsided, after the flashes of phones faded, I reached down, not for the discarded blue dress, but for the worn leather satchel I'd placed beside my chair. From it, I produced a plain, manila folder. It looked innocuous, almost forgettable, yet within its unassuming covers lay the meticulous chronicle of William's deceit. I placed it on the table before me, sliding it across the polished wood until it rested directly in front of the judge. She glanced at it, then at me, her expression still unreadable, but a flicker of curiosity now in her eyes. I opened the folder, revealing its contents. It wasn't a dramatic courtroom reveal with shouting and accusations. It was just evidence. Quiet, irrefutable. First, there were witness statements. Not from friends of mine, but from people in William's own circle. Colleagues, acquaintances, even a former employee of his. People who had grown tired of his casual cruelty, his blatant disregard for the truth. Their words, transcribed and notarized, detailed his increasingly open affair with Isabella, their public appearances, their shared vacations. Then photos. Not paparazzi shots, but discreet images, taken by a private investigator I'd hired using a portion of my secret portrait savings. Photos of William and Isabella in compromising positions, in places he swore he was on business trips. The dates, times, and locations were all meticulously documented. And finally, the most damning evidence of all, emails. Not just from Isabella, but from William himself. Conversations planning their future, mocking my quiet existence, even discussing how to legally minimize my share in the divorce settlement. Their own words laid bare, exposing the depth of their betrayal. I had compiled it all, piece by agonizing piece, in the quiet hours of the night, when William was out with Isabella, or when he was asleep beside me, oblivious to the storm I was meticulously gathering. Each document was a needle, weaving a tapestry of truth that was impossible to deny. William, who had been struggling to regain his composure, saw the folder. His eyes widened, first with disbelief, then with raw panic. He tried to spin it, to dismiss it as a fabrication, a desperate attempt to discredit him. "Your Honor, this is preposterous. My wife is clearly distraught, fabricating." But the judge, her gaze now fixed on the folder, held up a hand, silencing him. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm, but imbued with an authority that brooked no argument. "Mr. Campbell, I suggest you stay composed, if you hope to keep anything." The unspoken threat hung heavy in the air. Her eyes, cool and intelligent, then scanned the documents, her frown deepening with each passing page. The murmurs in the gallery had died down, replaced by a collective, palpable tension. And then, something truly unexpected happened. A figure rose from the back row of the gallery, slowly, deliberately. He was an older man, his hair a shock of wild white, a distinguished but eccentric air about him. He leaned heavily on a polished wooden cane. It was Mr. Crossman, the father of one of my new clients, an elderly gentleman whose portrait I had recently completed. I had helped him with his groceries on the bus just days earlier, a small act of kindness in an otherwise bleak week. He'd seemed harmless, perhaps a little frail. I certainly hadn't expected him to be here. He began to walk forward, his steps slow but resolute, his eyes fixed on the judge. The bailiff started to move, to stop him, but the judge held up a hand, a curious expression on her face. As Mr. Crossman approached the bar, the whispers started, growing louder, more distinct. "Is that Crossman? The Crossman?" It turned out, this eccentric man, this client's father, was a former high-profile attorney, a legend in the legal community. A man who used to be feared, absolutely, in every courtroom in the city. His name, once synonymous with ruthless legal victories, now carried the weight of a powerful, almost mythical past. He reached my table, his eyes, sharp and intelligent despite his age, meeting mine. He offered me a faint, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement, a silent message of support. And then, without a word, he pulled out the chair beside me, the one William's lawyer had left vacant, and he sat down. His presence, quiet yet monumental, instantly shifted the power dynamics in the room. He didn't speak, didn't open his mouth, but the message was clear. He was here. And he was with me. The air itself seemed to crackle with anticipation. William and his lawyer exchanged panicked glances, their confident bravado evaporating like mist in the morning sun. The scales of justice, so heavily tilted against me just moments before, were beginning to swing, slowly, inevitably, back into balance. The next week felt like a blur, a whirlwind of legal technicalities and quiet victories. Mr. Crossman, with his sharp mind and his formidable reputation, worked tirelessly, meticulously dismantling William's case. He didn't engage in theatrics or shouting matches. His strategy was quiet, precise, built on the undeniable weight of the evidence I had gathered. He simply presented the facts, the timelines, the damning emails, allowing the truth to speak for itself. He called no witnesses beyond me, and even my testimony was brief, factual, devoid of emotion. He let the documents paint the picture of betrayal, of financial malfeasance, of William's calculated attempts to hide assets and discredit me. The judgment came through with a swiftness that surprised even me. My marriage was dissolved, not with a whimper, but with a firm, resounding declaration. William lost all financial control of our shared assets. The properties, the investments, the accumulated wealth he had so confidently declared as his own, were now subject to a fair and equitable division, heavily favoring my contribution, both seen and unseen. The judge, in her final pronouncement, made it clear that William's attempts to manipulate the system, coupled with the overwhelming evidence of his infidelity and financial misconduct, had severely impacted his standing. Isabella, the polished mistress with the cutting smirk, disappeared the moment the judgment came through. Her loyalties, it seemed, were as superficial as her carefully constructed image. There were whispers of her returning to her hometown, of her attempting to rebuild a life that had suddenly, spectacularly collapsed. "William?" he shouted. He raged. He called it unfair, a travesty of justice, a conspiracy. He stood in the courtroom, red-faced and sputtering, railing against the judge, against Crossman, against me. But the courtroom, which had once silently absorbed his cruel mockery, didn't care. They applauded. A soft, rustling sound at first, then growing into a wave of genuine, heartfelt applause. The bailiff had to call for order. The judge, for her part, simply watched him, her expression a mix of weary disdain and quiet satisfaction. So did Crossman. He even offered a faint, approving smile, a rare glimpse of emotion on his usually stoic face. Later, as we walked out of the courthouse, the same wind that had chilled me just days before now felt like a cleansing breeze. Mr. Crossman, leaning on his cane, looked at me, his eyes twinkling with a dry amusement. "I've defended millionaires, Olivia," he said, his voice a low rumble, faced down corporate titans, battled the toughest prosecutors. "But helping you might be my favorite case yet." He didn't elaborate, didn't need to. His words were a balm, a quiet validation of the long, painful journey I had undertaken. I didn't go back to my tiny, lonely rental apartment. My phone, which had been silent for so long, now buzzed with messages. Not from pitying friends, but from people who had heard, who admired my quiet strength. One message, in particular, stood out. It was from Michael Chandler. He was the father of Edwin, the young boy whose portrait I was still working on, the commission that had helped fund my secret war chest. I had met Edwin a few times. He was a bright, curious child, and his father, Michael, was kind, gentle, and utterly unlike William. He offered me a job. Not as a nanny, not as staff. "Olivia," his voice was warm, steady. "Edwin adores you. He talks about you constantly. His art has blossomed since you started teaching him those little tricks. I was wondering if you'd consider coming on as a teacher for him. Full-time, if you like. And, well, perhaps as a partner, if you chose." He didn't push, didn't demand. He simply offered. Offered a space, a purpose, a chance. He asked me to stay. To stay in a home that was warm and vibrant and filled with the laughter of a child who saw me not as a scarecrow, but as someone who made colors talk. It was an unexpected lifeline, offered not out of pity, but out of genuine admiration. And in that moment, standing on the courthouse steps, the echoes of William's rage still ringing in my ears, I felt a quiet, profound sense of gratitude. The world, which had seemed so determined to break me, was offering a new path, a new beginning. I still paint. The brushes still feel like extensions of my fingers, the canvas a boundless world where imagination can roam free. But now, my studio isn't a cramped corner of a rental apartment or a hidden space I had to sneak into. It's a bright, sun-filled room in Michael's home, with large windows overlooking a sprawling garden. And now I teach too. Edwin, Michael's son, is my most enthusiastic student. He calls me Miss O, his voice bubbling with unbridled joy whenever I arrive. He says I make colors talk, that I teach him to see the world in hues he never imagined. His eyes, wide and curious, remind me of the artist I once was, before the world tried to dim my light. Every time I pass a mirror now, I see the woman who stood in that courtroom. Not as a victim, forever scarred by betrayal, but as a verdict. A verdict against the lies, against the dismissal, against the notion that a woman's worth is tied to her conformity. I see the quiet strength that bloomed in the dark, the resilience forged in the fire of humiliation. I see the woman who, piece by quiet piece, reassembled herself, not into the person William wanted, but into the woman she was always meant to be. There's no bitterness, no lingering shadow of resentment. Just a quiet, profound sense of peace. The pain of the past still exists, a faint scar, a reminder of where I've been. But it no longer defines me. It is simply part of my story, a chapter that led to a more vibrant, authentic existence. One day, Michael brought roses. Not a grand, ostentatious bouquet, but a simple, perfect bunch of deep red roses, the kind that smelled of damp earth and quiet promises. He met me on the courthouse steps, the same steps where I'd stood just months before, bruised but unbroken. The wind was gentle that day, carrying the scent of spring blossoms. He looked at me, his eyes warm and steady, reflecting a depth of understanding I hadn't known existed. He didn't talk about the past, didn't mention William or the trial. He simply held out the roses. And then, his voice soft but clear, he asked me something I never thought I'd hear again. Something I had long ago banished from the realm of possibility. Will you marry me, Olivia? I looked at him, truly looked at him. At the kindness in his eyes, the unwavering support in his gaze, the quiet respect he always showed. He wasn't offering to rescue me, he was offering to walk beside me. To share a life where my art, my quiet strength, my entire being was not just tolerated, but celebrated. And in that moment, under the gentle Seattle sky, with the scent of roses in the air and the warmth of his presence beside me, I smiled. A genuine smile, from deep within, unburdened by fear or doubt. I said yes. Not because I needed saving. Not because I needed a man to validate my existence. But because I had already saved myself. And in doing so, I had found my way back to a life that was truly my own, a life rich with purpose, with love, and with the quiet, undeniable strength of a woman who had outgrown the pain, embraced her true self, and found her way home. Have you found your way back from betrayal?